Ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to have with us Alison Davidian, the Country Representative Ad Interim for UN Women in Afghanistan. Ms. Davidian, the floor is yours.
It's been 344 days since the Taliban took power. And for most Afghan women and girls, almost every one of these days has brought a deterioration in their rights, their condition, and their social and political status. When I briefed you last September, I told you that decades of progress for Afghan women and girls was at risk of being erased. Today, I'm here to tell you that our fears have materialised. Over the past 11 months, we've seen an escalation of restrictive policies and behaviours towards women. Afghanistan is the only country in the world where girls are banned from going to high school. Women are restricted from working outside the home, except for a few sectors and particular roles. There are no women in cabinet, and there's no Ministry of Women's Affairs, effectively removing women's right to political participation. Women are required to have a male chaperone when they're travelling more than 78 kilometres, and they're also required to cover their faces in public. Combined, these restrictions limit the ability of women to earn a living, to access health education, to escape situations of violence, and to exercise their rights. And they further limit Afghanistan's ability to chart a way through crisis. But this is not news anymore. What I'm here to brief you on today is what these restrictions practically mean for women and girls living in Afghanistan now. Women I've met as I've travelled across provinces and districts in the country, and women who could have briefed you directly a few months ago, but now they're not able to leave their homes, go to work, or show their faces. Women told me of how the mahram policy is impacting on every aspect of their lives, from their freedom to go and buy bread and meet the essential needs of their families, to their ability to influence decision-making in the home. Women linked the mandatory face covering to their increasing invisibility. Some women told me that they're still able to go to market without a mahram, but they live in fear that one day they will be stopped and beaten for the act of going to buy groceries without a man. Some women also told me that Afghanistan feels safer now, that they're less afraid of indiscriminate attacks and relieved that conflict has subsided. But safety comes at the expense of agency. And for most women, this price is too high. Stories of loss reverberate across Afghanistan, but so too do stories of hope, even in the face of this loss. In every province I visited, women told me how they will not give up. They will not accept this exclusion from public life and restrictions on their right to work, to learn, and to have a voice. Women are forming new civil society organisations to meet community needs. They're running businesses, and they're still going to work to provide health and protection services. Many women across the world, the act of walking outside your front door is an ordinary part of life. But for many Afghan women, it is an act. It is extraordinary. It is an act of resistance. People often ask me, what can we do to support Afghan women and girls? How do we help? And the answer may sound simple, but it's transformative, proven time and time again by research and evidence. Invest in women. Invest in services for women, jobs for women, invest in women-led businesses, in women leaders, and in women organisations. For the international community, practically, this means three things. It means targeted, substantial, and systematic funding to programs that address women's rights and empowerment. It means prioritising to hear from Afghan women themselves on their needs. And it means continuing and strengthening advocacy on the full spectrum of their rights, including their right to work and engage in public and political life. It means facilitating women's meaningful participation in all stakeholder engagement on Afghanistan. And this includes delegations that meet with Taliban officials. Nothing undermines our mission more when we say to the Taliban, "Where are your women?" And they look at us and they say, "Where are yours?" UN Women is on the ground in Afghanistan, working every day to improve the lives of women and girls. We're scaling up provision of services for women, by women, to meet overwhelming needs. Health, education, and protection services are not only essential, but in this context, in this environment, they're life-saving. We're supporting women-led businesses and employment opportunities for women across all sectors. The full return of women to work is key to transforming Afghanistan's economy and supporting the country out of poverty. We're investing in women-led civil society organisations and the rebuilding of the women's movement. We know that the women's movement are key engines for progress and sustainability, accountability on women's rights, not just in Afghanistan, but everywhere in the world. And every day we're advocating for restoring, protecting, and promoting the full spectrum of women's rights, and creating spaces for Afghan women to advocate themselves for their right to live free and equal lives. Many Afghan women feel that they're now invisible and that the world has forgotten them, compounding their invisibility. Afghanistan is not the only country in the world where we're seeing rollbacks on women's rights. But what has happened in Afghanistan is an alarm bell for all of us, because it shows how decades of progress on gender equality and women's rights can be wiped away literally in months. What is happening in Afghanistan is a clarion call to everyone that the fight for women's rights in Afghanistan is a global fight. It's a battle for women's rights everywhere. And what we do or fail to do for women in Afghanistan reflects who we are and what we stand for as a global community.
Words. And we'll now turn the floor over to questions. Edie.
Thank you, Ms. Davidian, on behalf of the United Nations Correspondents Association. Thank you very much for doing this briefing. You've talked about what can be done to promote women in business, but what can be done to actually get the Taliban to change these policies? What specific actions is the United Nations taking, and what should the rest of the world be doing? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. For UN Women, the key focus for our work is empowering Afghan women and Afghan civil society organisations to be able to engage with the Taliban and to be able to engage with them to realise full rights. This is really the most sustainable form of change, and this is why it's so critical to be investing in women-led civil society and the women's movement. I think that's really key going forward. And in terms of what else the international community can be doing, it's key to be investing in programs that are also supporting women-led businesses and women-owned businesses as well.
Thanks. James?
James Bays from Al Jazeera. Thank you for doing this. You said that there was a clarion call to everyone right now because of the fate of Afghan women. I'd like to ask you very specifically within that everyone in the international community about a body in this building, the Security Council. You say that Afghan women say that they feel forgotten by the international community. What should the Security Council, which has more power perhaps than anywhere else in these United Nations, what should the Security Council do?
So I go back to the point about how the international community and member states need to be doing everything within their power to ensure that Afghanistan and Afghan women's rights remain on the table, including in resolutions. The Taliban travel ban is coming up soon. These are all forums and mechanisms that can be used to hold the Taliban to account and to ensure that they are governing for all Afghans. So this is really, the Security Council is one mechanism, but member states need to use all mechanisms at their disposal to keep the pressure on, to use their influence, and to advocate for the full spectrum of women's rights. Girls' right to education, but also women's right to work and women's right to be able to engage in public and political life. We need the full spectrum of women's rights advocated for.
Thanks. Mariam?
Thank you, Ms. Davidian. As you may know, Uzbekistan is holding a 2-day international conference on Afghanistan. Is UN Women in any way involved in these talks in Uzbekistan? I know that there are 20 countries who are attending this conference. What is the United Nations is doing in these conferences and talks with the Taliban?
Thanks for your question. So UN Women is not represented, but the UN is represented in this meeting in Uzbekistan. And events like this are important. They keep Afghanistan on the global stage, which is critical. But it's also important that there's meaningful participation of women in these events and all events going forward, including and especially Afghan women.
Ibtisam?
Thank you. My name is Ibtisam Azim from Al Arabi Al Jadid newspaper. I have first a question of update on regard of girls and school. Do you have any updates there? I know there were some problems. Is there anyone? Do you have any percentage statistics for us? And then also in the issue of women and small businesses, if I'm not mistaken, before the Taliban took over, the majority of small businesses in Afghanistan was in hands of women. How does the situation look like now? And can you elaborate on that? I know you talked a little bit about it, but are there some women who are still able to manage or have businesses, and in which sectors? Thank you.
Thanks for your question. So there are a lot of discussions happening, ongoing discussions by numerous stakeholders with the Taliban on the issue of girls going back to high school. We know that educating girls is really one of the most powerful equalizers on the road to gender equality. I will leave it to my sister agencies to give more information discussing directly with the Taliban on this issue. But in terms of small businesses, we've seen a great impact on the economy that has resulted from women not being able to go to work. There was an ILO report that has come out in the last months indicating that employment levels for the third quarter of last year for women had decreased by 16%. For the same period, employment levels for men had decreased by 6%. UNDP has also issued some data that shows that the loss of women's employment to the economy can result with up to a loss of $1 billion or 5% GDP. Now, in terms of small businesses, women's small businesses, many have had to stop operating. Many need support and injection of funds to be able to continue, but they are still continuing and looking for creative ways to be able to continue their businesses. We're seeing, particularly in the more traditional areas, handicrafts, weaving, food, these have been allowed to continue to operate. And UN Women is working to really support MSMEs, women-led MSMEs across the country in terms of seed capital and also capacity building support to allow them to be able to restart and continue.
Okay, Iftikhar, on screen.
Thank you, Farhan. Ms. Davidian, thank you for doing this briefing. I'm Iftikhar Ali from Associated Press of Pakistan. My question was asked by Edie, the very first one, but may I ask you, you paint a very grim picture, murky picture of human rights situation for women in Afghanistan, but do you see any chink of light, any ray of hope of their women's human rights getting better down the road?
I definitely see hope. My hope is in Afghan women leaders and the Afghan women's movement. We know what the Afghan women's movement has been able to achieve in Afghanistan. Afghan women got the right to vote in 1919, before women in the US got the right to vote. The first girls' school was established in 1921. The 1964 Constitution saw the guarantee of equal rights before the law. The 2004 Constitution enshrined gender equality. In every decade, we have seen progress on women's rights because of what the women's movement and women leaders have been able to do. And so my hope for Afghanistan lies in the women's movement, lies in women leaders. And that's why we need to invest in them and invest in women's civil society to continue to fight for their rights.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, one more question from Mariam.
Mariam from Afghanistan International. You talked about women civil rights activists and also women's movement in general in Afghanistan. But as we all remember, last time that women came on the street in Kabul and other parts of Afghanistan, they got arrested, they got beaten by the Taliban, they were in prison, and at some point they got raped in the jails of Afghanistan by the Taliban. So how can we just prevent these issues from happening again and also protect those women who are fighting for their lives in Afghanistan right now? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Again, I would go back to the point about the need to invest in women civil society organizations and invest in women leaders. There's a lot of different ways that women leaders and women civil society are working right now. Some women are protesting, although that has really been shut down. But there's other ways that women's organizations are operating. And it's a need to ensure that they have the funding to be able to continue, but also, and this is where the advocacy part comes in, the civic space to be able to engage and advocate for their rights. So it's both funding and both advocacy by the international community to ensure that they have the civic space to operate.
Are there any further questions? If not, I'd like once again to thank our guest, Alison Davidian, the director ad interim, the country director ad interim for UN Women in Afghanistan. Thanks very much for your briefing and for all your time with us. Have a great evening. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Have a good afternoon, everyone.